All right, welcome everyone to another episode of the Mammoth Growth podcast. I'm here today with Tim, who was previously VP of Data at FREENOW and is now a speaker and a data consultant, and Paddy, who's a senior consultant at Mammoth Growth and is one of our experts on everything related to mobile attribution. And we're here today to talk about some of the privacy-related changes that are coming in iOS 17 and the impact that those are going to have on you as a marketer or a data professional. A very quick disclaimer, nothing we say today should be considered legal advice. Obviously, it's important to have a good legal basis for any data processing you do, and you should speak to a lawyer in the markets in which you operate to understand that. Without further ado, I think there are two big changes coming in iOS 17 from a marketing privacy perspective. The first one is link tracking protection, and the second one is privacy manifests. So I think we're going to start with a very brief overview of each of those. And so, Tim, do you want to lead us off with link tracking protection?
Yeah, for sure. At first, thanks for having me, and nice to meet you in this surroundings, Paddy and Stuart. The first thing, I mean, in general, we can just say that Apple told us about the privacy apocalypse, the next generation, on the last WWDC after iOS 14.5, which was a lot of fun of us already, which we want to talk about later, I think. There's two more things. And I think the thing that's most relatable or graspable for everyone is this link tracking protection, which pretty much means that, well, I mean, all of you know, if you have a link, there's UTM parameters, there's Google Click IDs, there's anything else. And Apple will start cutting those. Apple will start cutting those. That means if you open a link from, for example, mail or messages, or if you open a link in Safari private browsing, all the link parameters that might identify you, which from my point of view are almost all of them, will be cut. Which, I mean, at first it doesn't sound that bad because it's only opening something from mail or messages or private browsing, which I think when you use private browsing, you have a certain idea what you want to browse in, and maybe these pages don't even do proper user tracking. But I think the bigger problem is really mail and messages. And I'm not sure how everyone else does it, but I use all the Apple things on my iPhone. I use a lot of Google tools on my web browser, but honestly, every link I open comes from mail. And I don't use messages that often. But mail has a very large market share. I think it's 60%. And almost everyone on iOS, more than 90% use Safari. We don't know how many use private browsing, but I think when Apple starts this with private browsing, it will probably extend a bit and at some point will be there in all the browsing modes. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
I've got the.
Yeah, go.
I was going to say I've got the iOS 17 beta on my phone, and in settings you can make it all browsing. So it is optional there for people if they want to just go in their settings and.
Nice. So it is there already. Nice. Yeah. Yeah, that's the first thing. And Paddy, do you want to lead on with a privacy manifest?
Yeah, so privacy manifests are essentially just a extension of the nutrition labels. So those are the things that you see on the App Store, which say, as an app, we collect this data about you and we use it for these purposes. There's a couple of interesting things that are coming out of the privacy manifests. One is that third-party SDKs, so people like your mobile measurement provider, your ad networks, or any kind of third-party code you have in the app, they'll also need to create the equivalent of what you're creating here. And then Apple will compile it all together to say, as an app as a whole, you and the third parties that you have in your app collect this data about your users and use it in this way. Why this is interesting is because often people used to just turn a blind eye and say we use this SDK, we don't really know what it does under the hood, but that's their problem. And now they're kind of, Apple's exposing this to not only the users of the app, but also the app developers themselves. So that's kind of like the transparency element of that. There's two other things which I think are more implementation and maybe technically focused, which will have a much bigger impact. One is there's a thing called required reasons. So essentially, and I think we'll talk about this a lot later on, but fingerprinting and probabilistic attribution, whatever you want to call it, have been quite big post iOS 14. And the required reasons API will say, if I'm an app or if I'm a third-party SDK, I'll have to explicitly say to Apple, I need this data for one of these reasons. And the reasons are really small. It's like, for example, to access the active keyboards, your two choices are either I am a app which exclusively makes custom keyboards, or I need a custom keyboard for my app for this specific purpose. And then as they go through the review process, Apple will easily be able to say, actually, you're not this. So you can see a world where the amount of data that these people can collect is significantly reduced. And then secondly, which I don't really know how it's going to play out in practice, but they're starting to see when your app makes HTTP requests to tracking domains, so to known tracking domains. And there's talk of how these requests will get blocked if you don't have ATT or app tracking transparency consent. Again, tested it on the beta, and I'm like, my user is still sending requests to like Google Firebase, to Facebook, to all of these things, even without consent. So I don't actually know what that means in practice, but you can see a world where without ATT consent, sorry, there's a bit of lorry that's just gone past, without ATT consent, like these requests getting blocked, and actually like, what does that mean for SDKs in the future? So those changes, yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like the big question at the moment is how broad will Apple go with that list of tracking domains, right? They could choose to block every MMP's domain, or they could choose to be very focused on APIs that they think track more than they should. And yeah. I don't think any of us really know at this stage, right? How far they'll go.
It's pretty much being back at the start of GDPR, right? I'm not sure how much you got in contact with that. You are in Europe, but most of your listeners probably in the States. But that was the same. We got all these awesome new regulations, and no one really knew how this fits because it wasn't really business related. And the whole privacy manifest goes very much in that direction, because you have this, Article 6 in the GDPR, which is also berechtigtes Interesse in German, so required reasons, and they're doing exactly the same thing. And we also never knew what are required reasons, which required reasons are fine. And we always wrote something down, but well, until now, we never really got challenged on that. But Apple is doing that in another way.
Yeah, I think what's quite interesting is like so you can see some developers who have kind of like looked into the iOS 17 builds, and like there's a difference in the way that they're approaching the link tracking protection and the way that they're approaching this like privacy manifest and tracking domain stuff. So there's specific links of so with link tracking protection currently in not link tracking protection, ITP in Safari currently, there's on-device machine learning which identifies trackers and does all this stuff. So they're taking that approach there, and then with link tracking protection and this kind of tracking domains, it's a fixed file per iOS release, and it kind of gets updated as and when new trackers are kind of identified. So at the moment, the list is actually pretty small of what UTM parameters will get stripped, and like, but actually the tracking domain list is really long. It includes stuff like Trustpilot and things like that, which I think would be quite baffling if they actually start blocking those requests.
For the tracking parameters, the biggest thing is probably the HubSpot IDs and the Google Click IDs and the Facebook Click IDs. That would be the most difficult thing for people in the future.
Yeah. I'm interested in like the email side of things, because that's probably where I don't know huge amounts, but like what's the big impact from a HubSpot ID perspective?
If you don't know who actually opened your email, so the HubSpot ID is pretty much the part of when you send any kind of marketing emails or CRM emails, and put a link in there. And the link will tell you exactly, this is this person saw the email, this person opened the email, this person clicked the email. So that's pretty much gone. Yeah,
but you should still be able to track clicks through redirect, right?
Sure.
Most of the clicks are wrapped. Most of the click URLs are wrapped in a redirect anyway, which should continue to work.
And you will also see. Yeah, and you will also see which user ID came into your system via this link, right? Because you track this on your first party side. That's
Yeah, so it's tying the two together that becomes really difficult, right? You'll see who clicked an email and you'll see who landed on your website, but do you know, and what those people who land on your website do, but do you know which email click drove which conversion or which order. Yeah.
So it's pretty much like losing the IDFA. I think it goes all in the same direction, right? It's all the direction that we have a cut in the middle, and this is the way we have to deal with in the future, or we already deal with since the iOS 14.5 apocalypse.
Yeah. So do you want to talk a bit about what you did at
FREENOW?
Let's do
that. I think that's also an interesting story, because I'm still talking at a lot of conferences, and for many people that don't really use apps or that are mainly web-based, this is all very new. For us, this is, the big pain already happened in 2020 and 2021. 2020, when we got, when we started knowing about this whole thing, and we realized, we now build all this great hyper user targeting tracking, which is also where I come from, right? I'm originally a bioinformatician data scientist. I started in industry in the early 2010s, where everything was hyper targeting. Everything was great. We had all the information. So I built these setups already like 5 times in different companies. And then at FREENOW, we also built this. We were finished in 2020, which was a huge chunk of work. And then, we got these awesome news, which in the beginning really made us be like, German, there's this saying, die geht der Arsch auf Grundeis, which is pretty much, we were really, really afraid, because we were like, oh, fuck, everything is gone. How are we going to deal with our users anymore? Because FREENOW, back then, I mean, the thing is, every kind of tech startup is always very numbers focused, right? So you're usually not focusing on brand too much, on out of home too much, but you're focusing on, this is where I get my numbers, this is how I steer. And this is also what we did, which, when you think about FREENOW, big mobility company, is already not that smart, because the main thing you want to do is to, people need to see something, and then they need to open the app, and then they need to get into a taxi. So it's a pretty big, media break between the digital and analog world. And that means there needs to be a lot of brand, out of home, and so on. So what we did was pretty early be like, we built all this. This is great. I mean, the structure is still okay, but we really have to deal with this now. And we have to go full on one level up to the campaign level and really start working in I don't want to call it marketing mix modeling, because that would be too fancy already, but more in the way of, we have to work with incrementality. We have to work with experimentation, and we have to use this opportunity to really join our information from brand campaigns and out of home campaigns with all our digital information. And then start building systems, which you can now call marketing mix modeling, which we also did, that really look at what's happening before the funnel, what's happening on the marketing side, and what are your target KPIs on the other side. And the other thing we also realized is, yes, this sounds very, very bad, but the good thing is also we're all in the same boat, right? It's not like back then Uber and Bolt had better means of targeting people. They had the same problem, exactly the same problem. So our goal was to just start dealing with this in the best possible way and be like, IDFA is gone. There was also this big discussion about, shall we now start using the people that give us their consent, which is usually like, if you're lucky, a third, usually less.
You need consent on both ends as well, right? Not just on...
exactly. Exactly. But I mean, as long as you don't get the consent for app tracking and at all, then there's nothing, right? And we always thought about, shall we use these 30% of iOS users and the 100% of Android users to build heuristics and then work on that? And we were like, nah, because obviously, which is the case, I think, in most Western countries and where app businesses operate. Yeah, you might have a large chunk of Android users, but the revenue comes from iOS users. So really using this large chunk of non-revenue generating users to predict the revenue generating users didn't make sense. And what we also said back then already is like, this is the start, right? This is the start where we start doing this. We already saw what happened with GDPR. And we were already quite sure we can now start building something for really taking care of the Google Ad ID a lot more, which will also then be gone in a few years. Not sure how many years, but that will happen for sure.
Yeah, I'm an Android user here, so it hurts a little bit to hear there's no revenue from us. But no, I know it's true, but sometimes it hurts a little.
I mean, it's not saying that Android users don't generate revenue. iOS users generate a lot more revenue, which is also not saying what each person does, right?
Yes. No, and I think what's what's always a challenge when you move away from user level tracking towards like more aggregate methods, whether it's like running incrementality tests or geographic tests, or whether it's building like media mix models, is ultimately like the granularity and timeliness of that data, right? So we've spent the last decade having almost immediate data at the user level, and now we're in a world where it's at the channel or campaign level, and it's often weekly, or like a test might even take a month or 2 months to run. How did you tackle like those challenges at FREENOW?
Not only at FREENOW. When I started working in the industry, my first job was doing TV tracking and uplift modeling. And that goes in a very similar direction. And we already had the issue back then, right? That the marketing managers were all used to, oh, I need daily data. But to be honest, even with the hyper targeting and everything else, daily data was never that smart, right? It made much more sense to really look at something like maybe a week. I always really liked the rolling week window. That was always quite useful, because then data will always change a bit. People will actually cancel their subscription, cancel their order, stuff like this. So most of your conversions also change a day later or 2 days later. So from my point of view, and I think, thank God, I work with a lot of very good technical and data-driven marketing people. It was always better to have a little bit more big picture view, because otherwise you really also significance rise, right? Sometimes you look at 40 users that come in over a week and you look at them daily. That doesn't make any sense. So I think we did this education-wise a lot before that. We were like, yes, please look at the daily data. And if we have very, very, very strong pushes, like, for example, FREENOW started private hire vehicles like UberX I think at the end of 2019. There we looked at data on a minute level. But again, when you think about the whole concept of marketing mix modeling or incrementality, we knew we do something at 10 a.m. in the morning, which will be a massive push. What does happen on the other side? So it's always like, it should be, causation and correlation, and not really just looking at the thing on a minute basis if you have no idea.
Yeah, and you're right. Probably a lot of that data that marketers were using that was very granular and very timely wasn't actually statistically significant, right? So they were making,
not at all.
Whilst you could make judgments and make decisions, maybe like there's probably an element of people were making those decisions too quickly and with too little data. And actually, maybe one of the benefits of this will be people are starting to think much more about whether the data is significant or not.
Exactly. And I mean, the good thing is also when you look at a week, you just have you have the numbers, right? And if you have the question like, hey, we started PHV and we did a push, is something happening? Is PHV increasing? Sure, fine. But if you have this kind of use case, it might also be okay to look on a minute basis or on an hour basis, but not like, oh, I started a campaign. Let's see what's happening. But what did I actually do with the campaign? What's the reason? What's the targeting? Yeah, that never really helped. And I mean, even if the targeting is quite strict, then if you get 2 people from your target group and 10 from another group, then doesn't tell you anything either.
Yeah, that makes sense. Should we go back to iOS 17 and talk a bit about like which of the changes are you worried about? Any of the changes? Like which ones do you think are going to have the biggest impact on marketers?
I'm not really worried anymore, because this whole pain of worrying is gone since 2022. I think the most interesting thing is really that the whole fingerprinting and probabilistic attribution will be gone, because I think this is difficult for all the marketing measurement partners, right? So we already asked ourselves, and we talked to AppsFlyer and Adjust directly, so how are you going to deal with that? And they were like, well, we talked to Apple, it's all going to be fine. Was fine. Let's not talk about how good or bad Scan and Scut are. But I think really the fingerprinting being gone is an issue, which is not a problem for me. So I'm not unhappy about this, because I already hated fingerprinting 10 years ago, because it's always involving IPs. And if you are a very mobile driven company, any kind of fingerprinting using an IP is completely useless anyways, or not useless, but I just don't trust it. So to be honest, I'm not sure whether I should say this, but I'm quite happy that stuff like fingerprinting is gone. That because there was never really something you could deal with.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think one thing that we saw is that quite a lot of people were using fingerprinting to kind of feel they were almost doing it lazily.
Yeah.
But when they're either doing it lazily or to fill gaps where SK ad network just wasn't there. So we saw quite a lot of people pushing ads to their website and then having a deep link or a deep link down from their website to install the app. And people were kind of using the MMP's fingerprinting methods to kind of track that deterministically. But I think pending SKAD Network 4 with web to app and that becoming available there, you're not going to be losing those big chunks of like Google search ad conversions anymore. So hopefully we'll see fewer people doing that kind of methodology to kind of get that. But then also, I think one thing with iOS 17 that is quite an interesting play from Apple is that by not giving access to these kind of like richer data points for the MMPs, like their fingerprinting accuracy is going to go down, and B, like if you wanted to carry on fingerprinting, it's then like an active choice from the app developer to do so. So like you still probably could send IP, OS, device, timestamp, server side to these things, but like it goes from I've got apps, let's say I've got AppsFlyer installed on my app and they're kind of collecting all of this data anyway, to I'm going to have to send this data to them and make that active choice, which I think is, you can no longer turn the blind eye and you can no longer just say, oh, we don't know what's going on here.
Yeah, I'm always a little bit going into the conspiracy theory direction here, because I mean, when we had the old iOS 14.5 thing starting, we were like, oh, all the data is gone. Suddenly, oh, if you do Apple search ads, you still get all the data. And if you use the SCAD network, you don't get all the data, but you get a lot of the data. From my point of view, it's going more and more in the direction that we might not need MMPs anymore, because if you push something to the App Store, to the Apple App Store, they will be your MMP.
I think that's right from the attribution perspective. I think, and Stuart and I actually talked about this the other day, like their kind of connections to ad networks, especially like the long tail, and then also just managing SK ad network, like especially as it gets more and more complex with like multiple postbacks, like you have to manage app releases, like different versionings, like all of this kind of stuff. I think the role of the MMP will kind of move slightly from being this like probabilistic attribution machine to like actually just a tool that helps you implement SK ad network essentially.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that I think is really important with an MMP is you don't want to have to wait until your next app release has been fully adopted to change your conversion value schema, right? So yes, you could build a system where the app kind of pings your own servers and downloads the latest conversion value mapping and then updates SKAD network, but that's a lot of infrastructure to maintain unless you're a very large company, and for what I guess an MMP is probably a cost effective enough that it's easier to purchase that than it is to build all that infrastructure yourself I guess I believe that like we should be experimenting with conversion value mappings and updating them over time, and also I get improving our understanding of which events or which early signals are most correlated with long-term like lifetime value. And so if we're doing that data analysis to become smarter about which users we bid for and like which events we send to SKAD network, we do need that mechanism to be able to roll those changes out quickly.
True. Yeah, it's all more learning, but I mean, it's like Apple got a lot closer to the MMPs, right? So that's let's see how it goes. It's still interesting, and I think there's also a lot of stuff going on behind closed doors, because as I said, when we talked about about iOS 14.5, where we didn't know about the SCAD and SCAN network, they were like, oh no, it's going to be fine. We're like, oh, but yeah, and it was fine in the end, right? It's not perfect anymore, but with the conversion value mapping, you still get loads of information, which I didn't expect, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think web to app has actually been one of the biggest gaps to date.
Yeah,
and I think it's been disappointing to some extent how slow the industry's been to adopt Scan 4 as a result.
Yeah. fingers crossed it'll all be fixed in the next 3 months, though. That's that's the timeline.
Do you know anything about this bug with SKAdNetwork 4 that's caused like Meta to roll back their support?
No. To be honest, I just started with it a few weeks ago because my current customers only have Adjust, and Adjust just rolled it out for the smaller customers a few weeks ago.
Cool.
Paddy, do you know?
Yeah, it's something to do with the conversion values kept on getting reset. So you're getting a lot of either null or zero conversion values. And the big problem with it is that that version of SKAdNetwork was tied to that iOS release. So they fixed the bug in, I think, 16.6, but that's like 1 month until it's in general, 1 month of beta until it's in general release, then like 2 to 3 months before you get 50+% adoption. And I think this is the problem that they're going to keep on facing with evolutions of SKAdNetwork, is you're going to have some people on 3, some people on 4. There's maybe a bug in one version, which means that it's going to take 3 months to fix anything before it can actually be done. And going back to our like MMP discussion, like being able to manage that, and like how do you ensure backwards compatibility? How do you make sure that you when you get all this data that you can actually use it, is probably the biggest challenge with SKAdNetwork going forward.
So MMPs are going to become the consultant and the dealer with all the privacy stuff coming up from our bigger partners.
Yeah. That's why they're going into like SKAdNetwork and data clean rooms.
Yeah, true.
And do we want to talk at all about the changes on Android and Privacy Sandbox?
I mean, it's still not there, right? It's I'm not sure. Did you read this article a few months ago, which really had a big outcry in my network, at least, because they did this test and they said, oh, it's all great. We realized everything tracking-wise and marking-wise works quite well. And we tested this with third-party cookies. And we were all like, so you tested your anonymized version with third-party cookies? How? What? Because you couldn't track it otherwise? Seriously, I was like, yeah, it's very, very intransparent what they're doing. And this article was really like, huh?
Yeah.
I think we all didn't get this. There were a lot of very interesting LinkedIn articles. A friend of mine wrote like, big caption, Google, what did you actually do there? And I think we never got an answer.
Yeah, it was something, it was like, topics, or the grouping people up into these topic audiences. Like only restricted advertising effectiveness by like single digit percentages. But I've also seen like Criteo, the big publisher, they did some testing where they compared their targeting with topics. And they found that and obviously it was written by their data science team, so pinch of salt on both sides, but their targeting was 5 times more effective at driving actions than this version. So I don't know where, it probably isn't single digits. It's probably not 5 times worse, but like there's still no clarity about like where in the middle it actually sits.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess Google have a big incentive not to roll it out when the performance is that much worse, right? Because they are one of the biggest advertising networks.
Yeah. Would be shooting themselves in the foot a lot.
Yes. Okay, so what's the one most important thing that advertisers should be doing now to deal with these changes and the ones we've seen over the last couple of years?
From my point of view, it's really, you have to follow your use cases. Understand what you actually want to change in your business or how your business is behaving. So what's your target KPI? What are you actually doing to change that target KPI? And then, well, I mean, in the end, it's all incrementality and uplift testing. For me, it's nothing else anymore, because this is what will always be working. It will be a bit more painful if you're very big and if you're doing a lot of different campaigns and markets. But I think people have to get accustomed to the idea that this is where the future is going to. And it's also something I said a few months ago on a conference. In the end, everything you learned 20 years ago in university when you were still young, do that again. That's where we are again. This is back. And I mean, people in our age, at least Stuart in my age bracket, Paddy, you're probably a little bit younger. We learned this 20 years ago, and we know how to do this. So don't be afraid to use that again, because the hyper targeting is gone, and it will be gone even more soon.
Paddy, what do you think?
I think, yeah, I was going to echo that completely. Like, don't continuously try to plug the gaps with user level data. No. Like, it's like a real short-term fix. And I think it was Eric Suffolk calls it like something whack-a-mole. And it's essentially like you can keep on doing it, but like ultimately you're going to have to invest in these technologies. So it's probably worth like spending time now to truly understand them, implement them properly, see what's right for you. And like, rather than what happened with iOS 14, where it's like everybody had to try and scramble to fix it. Like, if you can get ahead of these changes on Android that are coming, like, you know, where everyone knows where it's going, it's quite easy to see the future. Yeah. So like starting to prepare yourself now by really upskilling in these other different methodologies would be really useful.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to also be systematic about the lift testing you're doing, right? It's very easy to run like lots of one-off lift tests, run them all with a different methodology, and it ends up becoming like you just end up with holes all over the place because you've tested this and you've tested that, but you haven't tested the third, fourth, and fifth things. And then also like making sure you're bringing that data into your regular reporting, because there's no point having a bunch of one-off, like you don't want to have to hold the incrementality numbers in your head for every campaign, every time you're looking at a dashboard. So I think it's really important that you have a system for like integrating that incrementality data into your kind of day-to-day reporting, so you can be making decisions based not just on the data you get from the ad network, but also your understanding of like how that kind of translates into an incremental number.
That's actually a very good point. It's not just this, it's also being the marketing, tech, or data people in the companies. You have to educate the rest of the company and really make them understand why we are doing this and why this is the right way to go forward, and how to maybe change the mindset a bit and steer on these numbers and not on the tiny numbers you had before.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Well, thank you both. I think it's been a great conversation. And yeah, look forward to speaking to you both soon.
Been fun. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Let's do it again. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.